Sisu, 2022. The Finnish action legend that redefined grit on screen. An introduction to the phenomenon. Every few years, a film arrives that seems to bypass the usual machinery of blockbuster filmmaking and instead carves its own singular path, brutal, stripped down, and unmistakably confident in what it is trying to say. Sisu, the 2022 Finnish action thriller from writer-director Jalmari Helander, is exactly that kind of film. It doesn't lean on franchise nostalgia, doesn't chase trend-driven spectacle, and doesn't pad its runtime with subplots designed to test audience patience. Instead, it commits fully to a single, elemental premise: an aging gold prospector, wronged by soldiers who underestimate him, becomes an unstoppable force of vengeance. What emerges from that premise is a film that critics and audiences alike embraced as one of the most purely satisfying action experiences in recent memory, a movie whose title alone, Sisu, a distinctly Finnish concept meaning an almost otherworldly reserve of stoic determination and courage in the face of impossible odds, became shorthand for the film's entire philosophy. To understand why Sisu resonated so strongly, it helps to trace its origins, its creative lineage, its production story set against the stark beauty of Finnish Lapland, and the path it took from a festival midnight screening to a genuine international hit that eventually spawned a sequel. This is the story of how a modestly budgeted European genre film became a global talking point. The premise: vengeance written in blood and snow. At its narrative core, Sisu tells a deceptively simple story. The setting is the closing months of World War II, specifically during the little-discussed but historically significant Lapland War, the conflict fought between Finland and Nazi Germany after Finland's armistice with the Soviet Union forced German troops to withdraw from Finnish territory. Amid this chaotic and violent retreat, we meet a solitary man traveling alone through the barren wilderness with his horse and dog, panning for gold in the aftermath of the fighting. He is not introduced with grand fanfare or exposition-heavy dialogue. Instead, the film lets his actions do the talking, revealing only gradually that this quiet, weathered prospector was once a legendary commando in the Finnish army, a man whose reputation for surviving the unsurvivable had earned him a fearsome nickname among his enemies. When he strikes an enormous vein of gold, his fortune should represent a happy ending to a life spent in isolation and hardship. Instead, it makes him a target. A retreating platoon of Waffen-SS soldiers, led by a sadistic and morally bankrupt officer, discovers his cache of gold and decides that robbing and killing him will be simple work. They have misjudged their target catastrophically. What follows is not a conventional battle but a methodical, increasingly mythic campaign of retribution, as the prospector uses his old skills, the unforgiving terrain, and sheer refusal to die to dismantle the platoon one soldier at a time. The film escalates with each encounter, embracing an almost folkloric exaggeration of violence that never loses its grounding in the character's singular willpower. This structure, stripped of unnecessary complexity, focused entirely on one man's relentless drive, is what gives Sisu its unusual power. It isn't attempting to be a war epic in the traditional sense. It is, at its heart, a survival myth, a piece of contemporary folklore about the specific, almost untranslatable Finnish quality that gives the film its title. Jalmari Helander's creative journey to Sisu. Behind the camera, Sisu represents both a return to form and something of a creative rebirth for director Jalmari Helander. Finnish audiences and genre film enthusiasts already knew Helander's name from his earlier features, including the offbeat holiday horror film that first put him on the international radar and the action comedy Big Game, which saw a young prince and an American president fighting for survival in the Finnish wilderness. Helander has always shown a fascination with rugged, remote landscapes as settings for larger-than-life confrontations, and Sisu can be seen as the culmination of that recurring interest, refined into its purest and most effective form yet. Interestingly, Sisu was not originally intended to be Helander's next project after Big Game. He had been developing a very different film, a science fiction comedy with an entirely different tone and scope. However, the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted those plans in ways that reshaped Helander's creative trajectory. With the sprawling ambitions of the science fiction comedy project rendered impractical by the global disruption, Helander shifted his focus toward a smaller, more contained story that could be shot with a leaner crew in an isolated environment, circumstances that, perhaps serendipitously, aligned perfectly with the kind of stripped-down, elemental narrative Sisu would become. Sometimes constraint breeds clarity, and in this case, the pandemic-driven pivot pushed Helander toward a story that plays to his greatest strengths as a filmmaker: economy of narrative, striking use of landscape, and a willingness to let violence carry symbolic and even mythic weight. Helander has spoken about the specific inspirations that shaped the film's tone and central figure. The 1982 action classic that introduced audiences to a haunted, hyper-competent war veteran pushed to his breaking point by hostile authority clearly echoes through Sisu's DNA, particularly in the way an ordinary-seeming man is revealed to possess devastating combat skills once provoked. But even more directly influential was the real historical legacy of a legendary Finnish military sniper who fought against the Red Army during the Winter War, a marksman whose confirmed kill count and near-mythical reputation made him one of the most feared and respected soldiers in modern military history. That real-world legend of quiet, devastating competence under the harshest possible conditions clearly informs the character at the center of Sisu, whose backstory as a decorated commando gives weight and plausibility to his seemingly superhuman feats. Casting the unstoppable force. Central to Sisu's success is its lead performance, delivered by Finnish actor Jorma Tommila. Tommila brings a remarkable physical and emotional economy to the role of the prospector, communicating decades of trauma, loss, and hardened resolve through expression and posture rather than dialogue. It's a performance built on stillness punctuated by sudden, explosive violence, and it anchors the film's mythic tone in something believably human. Tommila's minimal, weathered presence recalls classic archetypes of the silent avenger, yet he never allows the character to feel like a mere genre exercise. There's a soulfulness underneath the brutality that keeps the audience emotionally invested even as the body count climbs. Supporting Tommila is a cast that spans multiple nationalities, reflecting the film's identity as an international co-production. Norwegian actor Aksel Hennie takes on the role of the story's primary antagonist, the brutal and corrupt Waffen-SS officer whose casual cruelty sets the plot's chain of violence into motion. Hennie brings a chilling, almost bureaucratic menace to the role, portraying a man who has grown comfortable with atrocity and remains utterly unprepared for an opponent who refuses to behave like a victim. Jack Doolan and Mimosa Willamo round out significant supporting roles, each adding texture to the ensemble of soldiers and captives caught in the escalating conflict. Notably, Onni Tommila, who audiences may recognize from earlier collaborations with Helander, also appears in the film, adding a layer of continuity to the director's recurring creative partnerships. Together, this cast forms a tight, purposeful ensemble that never distracts from the film's central, singular focus. Shooting in the Arctic wilderness. Few elements contribute as powerfully to Sisu's identity as its setting, and that identity was achieved through genuinely demanding production choices. The film was shot in 2021 near the remote village of Nuorgam, located in the Utsjoki region of Finnish Lapland, one of the northernmost, most sparsely populated areas in the country, sitting well above the Arctic Circle. This wasn't an incidental backdrop. The vast, punishing, breathtakingly beautiful landscape becomes almost a character in its own right, its open skies and stark terrain amplifying the sense of isolation that defines the protagonist's existence. Shooting in such an environment presented obvious logistical challenges, yet the authenticity gained from filming on location, rather than relying heavily on artificial sets or extensive digital backdrops, gives Sisu a tactile, lived-in quality that greatly enhances its impact. The wide, unbroken vistas of Lapland allow the film's action sequences to breathe, offering a sense of scale that reinforces just how alone the protagonist is against his heavily armed pursuers, while also emphasizing the harsh natural conditions that become both an obstacle and, eventually, a weapon in his campaign of resistance. All of this was accomplished on a comparatively modest production budget of roughly €6 million, equivalent to approximately $6.5 million at the time. In an industry increasingly defined by nine-figure blockbuster budgets, Sisu's achievement in delivering such visually striking, viscerally effective action on a fraction of that spending became part of its story, a demonstration that resourceful filmmaking and strong directorial vision can outperform sheer financial scale when it comes to genuine audience impact. From Finland to the world, distribution and release. Sisu's journey to international audiences reflects the increasingly globalized nature of genre filmmaking. As an international co-production between Finland and the United States, the film needed strong distribution partners to reach beyond its home market, and it found them. Sony Pictures' worldwide acquisition secured the film's distribution rights across most of the globe, outside the Nordic countries, recognizing the crossover appeal of its stripped-down, universally comprehensible premise of righteous vengeance. Meanwhile, Lionsgate, through Stage 6 Films, acquired the rights to distribute the film across North America, a decision that would prove shrewd given the enthusiastic reception the film would go on to receive from American audiences and critics who responded strongly to its unapologetic embrace of hard-edged, practical action filmmaking. The film's public unveiling came at one of the world's most prestigious platforms for genre cinema, the Midnight Madness program at the Toronto International Film Festival, where it debuted on September 9, 2022. The Midnight Madness slate has long served as a launching pad for boundary-pushing genre films seeking word-of-mouth momentum, and Sisu's premiere there generated exactly the kind of buzz the filmmakers and distributors were hoping for, with early audiences responding enthusiastically to its unrelenting pace and inventive brutality. From there, the film's rollout extended across several months and multiple markets. It premiered in Finland on January 27, 2023, allowing home audiences to see this distinctly Finnish story of resilience and identity on their own soil first. The film's wider release followed in the United States on April 28, 2023, where it was met with strongly positive reviews from critics who praised its lean storytelling, its unflinching action choreography, and its willingness to fully commit to the mythic register of its premise without irony or apology. Critical reception and cultural impact. What ultimately elevated Sisu beyond being merely a well-executed genre exercise was the breadth and enthusiasm of its critical reception. Reviewers repeatedly highlighted the film's refusal to overcomplicate its narrative, framing that restraint as a strength rather than a limitation in an era when many action films feel bloated with unnecessary subplots and franchise-building obligations. Critics praised the way Helander used the film's Lapland setting not just as scenery but as an active participant in the story's brutal logic, and many singled out Jorma Tommila's performance as a masterclass in communicating character through physicality alone. Beyond individual reviews, Sisu tapped into something culturally resonant. The film's title, drawn from a concept deeply embedded in Finnish national identity, introduced international audiences to a word and worldview that don't have a precise English equivalent, an almost spiritual commitment to enduring hardship through sheer force of will. In championing this concept so directly, the film became something of a cultural ambassador, sparking renewed interest among global audiences in Finnish history, particularly the lesser-known Lapland War, and in the broader philosophy of stoic endurance that Finns have long associated with their national character. The film's balance of brutal, almost cartoonishly excessive violence with a genuinely soulful emotional core also became a frequent point of critical discussion. Rather than feeling tonally inconsistent, this combination gave Sisu a distinctive identity that separated it from more generic action fare. Audiences weren't just watching a man fight soldiers. They were watching an embodiment of a cultural ideal refusing to be extinguished, using violence as an expression of that unbreakable resolve rather than as empty spectacle. Legacy and the road to a sequel. The strength of Sisu's reception, both critical and commercial, set the stage for further expansion of its story. In a testament to how thoroughly the film captured audience imagination, a sequel titled Sisu, Road to Revenge arrived years later, released on November 21, 2025. Notably, this follow-up was met with a similarly positive response from critics and audiences, suggesting that the appeal of Sisu wasn't a one-time novelty but a genuinely sustainable creative approach, proof that Helander's vision for this character and this mythic mode of storytelling had staying power well beyond its original release. The existence of a successful sequel also speaks to how Sisu managed to do something increasingly rare in modern action cinema. It created a new, distinctive cinematic icon from scratch, without relying on pre-existing intellectual property, franchise recognition, or established comic book or literary source material. In an industry often criticized for risk aversion and over-reliance on established brands, Sisu's success stands as a reminder that original, confidently executed genre filmmaking can still break through and build lasting audience loyalty. Conclusion: why Sisu endures. Ultimately, what makes Sisu such a compelling entry in modern action cinema isn't simply its impressive body count or its unforgettable setting, though both certainly contribute to its appeal. It's the way Jalmari Helander and his collaborators managed to fuse historical specificity, mythic storytelling, and razor-sharp genre execution into something that feels both deeply Finnish and universally accessible. The film honors a real, painful chapter of Finnish history, the brutal endgame of the Lapland War, while transforming it into a story about resilience that resonates far beyond its national origins. Jorma Tommila's committed, nearly wordless performance gives the film its beating heart, while the unforgiving beauty of the Lapland wilderness gives it an unforgettable visual identity that few other action films of its era can match. Backed by savvy international distribution through Sony and Lionsgate, and launched with real momentum from its Toronto Midnight Madness premiere, Sisu found the platform it needed to reach the wide, appreciative audience its craftsmanship deserved. And with a sequel already extending its story to continued acclaim, Sisu has secured its place not just as a memorable one-off action thriller, but as the foundation of an ongoing cinematic legacy, one built on a word, a philosophy, and a performance that audiences around the world won't soon forget. Sisu, 2022. Inside the bloody, brilliant odyssey of Artemi Korpi, a man alone in a dying war. The story of Sisu begins not with an army, not with a mission, but with a solitary figure and the two companions who mean more to him than any human society ever could, his horse and his dog. It's late 1944, and the Lapland War, Finland's brutal, often overlooked final chapter of World War II, fought against a retreating Nazi Germany, rages across the frozen north. Amid this chaos, a weathered prospector named Artemi Korpi searches for gold, seemingly indifferent to the collapsing world around him. This opening choice tells us everything about who Artemi is before a single word of backstory is offered. He is a man who has already survived war once, and who now wants nothing more than to be left alone with the earth beneath his feet. Fate, of course, has other plans. When Artemi strikes an extraordinary vein of gold, unearthing a fortune's worth of nuggets, his quiet solitude collides head-on with a collapsing military machine desperate for anything of value to salvage from defeat. He begins traveling toward the town of Rovaniemi, gold in tow, blissfully unaware that his discovery is about to make him the most hunted man in Lapland. First contact, the platoon that underestimates him. Artemi's path soon crosses that of a large Waffen-SS platoon commanded by the coldly efficient Obersturmführer Bruno Heldorf. This isn't a disciplined fighting force in retreat, it's a scorched earth operation, burning villages as it withdraws toward Norway and dragging along a group of captured Finnish women as prisoners. It's a chilling introduction to Heldorf, establishing him not as a soldier fighting honorably against impossible odds but as a man perfectly comfortable with cruelty when it serves his purposes. In a moment thick with dramatic irony, Heldorf barely glances at Artemi as their paths cross, allowing the aging prospector to pass without incident. He has no idea who, or what, he has just let walk away. It's the platoon's fatal misjudgment, one that will unravel their entire retreat. Artemi's true test comes almost immediately after, when a second, smaller unit of SS soldiers stumbles across his gold-laden saddlebags. What follows is the film's real thesis statement, delivered through action rather than dialogue. The soldiers mock him, treating the robbery as an easy, even amusing exercise, until Artemi dismantles all of them with terrifying speed and precision. It's a masterstroke of setup and payoff. The audience, like the soldiers, has been given no reason yet to expect this level of lethality from a quiet old gold prospector. The gunfire draws Heldorf back to investigate, and what he finds, a massacre and a single gleaming nugget from Artemi's fortune, transforms his indifference into obsession, the minefield and the legend revealed. What follows is one of the film's most audacious set pieces. Heldorf pursues Artemi with tank support, chasing him to the edge of a minefield, where tragedy strikes. Artemi's beloved horse is killed by a landmine. It's a gut-punch moment, stripping away the last vestige of companionship Artemi has left, and it would be easy to expect this loss to break him. Instead, in a moment of almost mythic composure, Artemi calmly gathers his scattered gold while Heldorf and his men watch from a distance, then deliberately detonates a second mine simply to cover his escape. It's a stunning show of nerve, using the very danger meant to kill him as a tool for his own survival. Desperate to stop him, Heldorf sends soldiers into the minefield after Artemi, only to watch them blown apart one after another. To secure a safer route, Heldorf callously forces two of his female captives to walk ahead of his men, using their lives as literal minesweepers, a chilling illustration of just how little he values human life outside his own self-interest. It's during this pursuit that the film delivers its crucial piece of backstory. Retrieving Artemi's dog tag, Heldorf's second-in-command Wolf learns via radio transmission exactly who they've been hunting. Artemi is no ordinary prospector, he is a former Finnish army commando who, after losing his family during the brutal Winter War against the Soviet Union, transformed into an unstoppable one-man fighting force. So devastating was his effectiveness against Soviet troops that Stalin's own Red Army gave him a nickname dripping with dread, Koshchei, the Immortal, a reference to the deathless folklore villain of Slavic legend. This revelation reframes everything the audience has witnessed so far. Artemi isn't lucky or improvising. He is executing exactly the kind of relentless, merciless campaign that once made him a living legend of terror on the battlefield. Rather than being deterred by this revelation, Heldorf becomes even more determined. In a moment that crystallizes his character, he explicitly defies orders to continue his retreat, choosing instead to pursue Artemi and reclaim the gold. His reasoning is coldly pragmatic, with Germany's defeat all but certain, that gold represents his best chance to bribe his way out of a hangman's noose. Heldorf isn't fighting for ideology anymore, he's fighting for his own survival, and he's willing to sacrifice his men to secure it. The hunt intensifies, dogs, water, and silent death. With the minefield behind them, Heldorf's forces escalate their pursuit, bringing in tracking dogs to follow Artemi's scent. In a small but telling character beat, Artemi's first instinct is to protect his own dog, sending the animal to safety before using petrol siphoned from a German truck to mask his own trail. It's a quiet reminder that beneath the legend of Koshchei, there remains a man capable of tenderness, just one who has learned to compartmentalize it in service of survival. The German search dogs eventually locate him anyway, forcing Artemy into a nearby lake in a desperate bid to escape. What follows is one of the film's most inventive and unsettling sequences. Helldorf dispatches 3 soldiers onto the lake by boat to finish the job, but Artemy turns the water itself into a weapon, striking from below to kill 2 of the men by slitting their throats and then breathing in the air, escaping from their severed windpipes to extend his time underwater. It's visceral, almost primal filmmaking, stripping away any romanticism from combat and replacing it with something closer to survivalist horror. The third soldier, terrified by what is witnessed, tries to flee the boat entirely, only to be executed by Wolf for the unforgivable sin of desertion, underscoring just how merciless discipline within Helldorf's ranks has become. Reaching the river bank, Artemy uses the body of the fallen German soldier as a human shield against incoming gunfire, buying himself the seconds necessary to escape onto the opposite shore. It's here that his luck briefly turns against him. His loyal dog, having been sent away for its own safety, is discovered by Helldorf's men on the far bank, leverage that the ruthless officer wastes no time exploiting. Rovaniemi in ashes. Artemy's journey brings him to Rovaniemi, only to find the town already reduced to burning ruins by the retreating German forces, a devastating visual echo of the historical reality of the Lapland War, during which German troops implemented a scorched earth policy against the very Finnish allies who had turned against them. Seeking shelter among the wreckage of a petrol station, Artemy finds himself, however briefly, granted a moment of respite. That respite doesn't last. Helldorf, still holding Artemy's dog, uses the animal in one of the film's most morally repugnant maneuvers, sending the dog to find its owner with a live grenade strapped to its collar. It's a moment engineered for maximum tension, forcing Artemy into an impossible split-second choice. True to form, he manages to fling the grenade aside in time to save his dog's life, but the explosion's proximity knocks him unconscious, finally giving Helldorf's men the opening they've been chasing for the entire film. Left for dead, and refusing to stay that way. With Artemy finally incapacitated, Helldorf, Wolf, and their tank driver Schütze seize the moment, hanging him and making off with his hard-won gold, leaving him to die alone in the ruins. It should be the end. Instead, in a moment of almost unbearable physical intensity, Artemy manages to impale one of his own wounds on a jagged piece of protruding rebar, using the resulting slack in the rope to keep himself alive, even as he remains suspended and severely weakened. It's a sequence that leans fully into the film's mythic register, presenting survival not as luck but as an act of sheer, almost inhuman willpower, the literal embodiment of the untranslatable Finnish concept that gives the film its title. The convoy's growing dread. Helldorf's convoy soon stumbles upon the abandoned aircraft blocking their path, and it's here that the psychological toll of hunting an apparently unkillable man begins to show. Wolf makes a gruesome discovery. The pilot inside the plane has been strangled using the very same rope that had been used to hang Artemy hours earlier. It's a darkly poetic detail, a signature calling card that leaves no doubt about who is responsible, and a clear signal that Artemy has not only survived but has turned his own near execution into a tool of vengeance. Visibly rattled, Helldorf orders his convoy to press forward without further investigation, and the balance of power in this deadly pursuit has unmistakably shifted. The rescue and the reckoning. The film's climactic movement begins as Artemy closes the distance on the convoy, climbing aboard the truck holding the captive Finnish women. In swift, decisive fashion, he eliminates their guards and arms the women themselves, transforming them from passive victims into active participants in the coming battle. Among them, a woman named Aino emerges as their natural leader, seizing control of one of the trucks and turning it into a weapon in its own right, allowing the newly armed women to unleash devastating gunfire on the remaining German soldiers. With the convoy thrown into chaos, Artemy makes his boldest move yet, leaping onto Helldorf's tank in the middle of the firefight. He forcibly extracts Wolf from inside the vehicle, leaving him at the mercy of the very women his side had spent the film degrading and endangering, a fittingly ironic reversal of power. Helldorf himself refuses to go down with his men, fleeing toward a commandeered Soviet aircraft. In a final act of ruthless self-preservation, he kills his own driver, Schütze, without hesitation before attempting to escape by air. The final confrontation in the sky. Even a stolen plane cannot save Helldorf. Artemy opens fire on the aircraft as it attempts to take off, fatally wounding the pilot, before performing one last extraordinary feat, using his pickaxe to physically climb aboard the plane while it's already airborne. What follows is a brutal, close-quarters struggle between the two men who have spent the entire film locked in a battle of wills, Helldorf representing the desperate, self-serving remnants of a collapsing regime, and Artemy embodying an older, harder form of endurance forged by loss and war. For a moment, it looks as though Helldorf might actually gain the upper hand in their hand-to-hand fight. But Artemi, ever resourceful, executes one final, decisive maneuver, hooking a static line to a bomb still aboard the aircraft and releasing it, sending Heldorf plunging to his death below. With his enemy finally eliminated and the plane's pilot already dead, Artemi straps himself in as best he can and rides the doomed aircraft down into a swamp, bringing his harrowing odyssey of survival and vengeance to its violent, fitting conclusion. Why this ending resonates. What makes this final act of Sisu so satisfying isn't merely the sequence of increasingly inventive kills, though they are undeniably a major part of the film's appeal. It's the way the narrative structure mirrors the emotional journey embedded in its title concept. Artemi is stripped of nearly everything over the course of the story: his horse, his solitude, his gold, even his own physical safety, and yet each loss only seems to sharpen his resolve rather than diminish it. Heldorf, by contrast, becomes progressively more desperate and morally compromised with each passing setback, willing to sacrifice his own men, endanger innocent captives, and ultimately abandon his post entirely in pursuit of self-preservation. By the time the two men finally clash in that mid-air struggle, the outcome feels almost inevitable, not because the film has telegraphed it clumsily, but because it has spent its entire runtime demonstrating precisely why a man defined by unbreakable endurance was always going to outlast one defined by naked self-interest. It's this thematic clarity, paired with relentlessly inventive and visceral action, that elevates Sisu's climax beyond simple genre spectacle into something closer to modern folklore, a story about what happens when an implacable force of will refuses, again and again, to accept defeat. The faces behind Sisu, meet the cast that brought Finland's deadliest legend to life, an ensemble built for a singular story. At first glance, a film as stripped down and relentlessly focused as Sisu might seem like a one-man showcase, and in many ways, it is exactly that, built around a single unstoppable protagonist tearing through a platoon of enemies. But the true strength of Sisu lies in how carefully every supporting role, no matter how small, is calibrated to serve that central story. Every soldier, every captive, every fleeting face on screen exists to either escalate the danger Artemi Korpi faces or to illuminate some new facet of the brutal world he's fighting to survive. Behind that tightly constructed ensemble is a cast blending established Finnish and international talent with a roster of rising performers, each contributing to a film that feels lean, purposeful, and utterly committed to its mythic vision. Let's take a closer look at the people who brought this unforgettable story to life. Jorma Tommila as Artemi Korpi, the silent storm. At the absolute center of Sisu stands Jorma Tommila, delivering what may be the definitive performance of his career as Artemi Korpi, the gold prospector whose quiet exterior conceals a legendary and terrifying past. This is a role built almost entirely on physicality and presence rather than dialogue, and Tommila rises to that challenge with remarkable control. Every glance, every controlled breath, every deliberate movement communicates decades of buried grief and hard-won survival instinct. It's a performance that asks the audience to read years of trauma and resolve into a face that rarely changes expression, and Tommila pulls it off with a gravity that makes the character's escalating acts of violence feel earned rather than gratuitous. What makes Tommila's work here especially compelling is the way he balances two seemingly contradictory qualities: the weary, almost gentle demeanor of a man who simply wants to be left alone with his horse, his dog, and his gold, and the coiled, predatory efficiency of a former commando once feared by an entire army. Watching those two identities merge over the course of the film, culminating in scenes of startling brutality delivered with almost eerie calm, is a huge part of what gives Sisu its unique tone. Tommila doesn't play Artemi as an action hero reveling in his own capability, he plays him as a man doing what he must, with the exhausted efficiency of someone who has been forced down this road before and knows exactly how it ends. Aksel Hennie as Bruno Heldorf, cruelty with a calculator. Opposite Tommila, Norwegian actor Aksel Hennie takes on the role of Obersturmführer Bruno Heldorf, the film's central antagonist and the man whose greed sets its entire chain of violence into motion. Hennie's performance is a masterclass in a very particular kind of villainy, not theatrical, snarling menace, but the colder, more unsettling cruelty of a man who has simply stopped seeing the people around him as human beings worth considering. Heldorf commits horrifying acts throughout the film with an almost bureaucratic detachment, treating captives as expendable tools and his own soldiers as disposable resources in pursuit of his goal. What elevates Hennie's performance is the way he layers in Heldorf's growing desperation as the story progresses. This is a man who begins the film as a confident officer overseeing a retreat and gradually unravels into something far more unhinged, driven by an increasingly obsessive need to reclaim the gold and secure his own survival in a war he knows is already lost. Hennie charts that psychological erosion with real precision, making Heldorf simultaneously loathsome and, in a strange way, pathetic, a man so consumed by self-interest that he fails entirely to recognize the magnitude of the enemy he's chosen to provoke. Jack Doolan as Wolf, the voice of grim discipline. Jack Doolan brings a sharp, watchful intensity to the role of Wolf, Heldorf's second-in-command and, in many respects, the audience's window into just how dangerous Artemis truly is. It's Wolf who uncovers the crucial revelation of Artemis' identity as the legendary, immortal, Commando, and Doolan plays that discovery with genuine unease, letting the audience see the moment his character truly grasps the scale of the mistake his unit has made. Throughout the film, Wolf operates as a kind of grim enforcer of discipline within Heldorf's ranks, most chillingly demonstrated when he executes a fellow soldier for attempting to desert during the film's harrowing lake sequence. Doolan brings a coiled, humorless intensity to these moments that makes Wolf feel like a genuinely dangerous presence even when he's operating in Heldorf's shadow. Mimosa Willamo as Aino, strength forged in captivity. Among the film's captive Finnish women, Mimosa Willamo's portrayal of Aino stands out as a vital turning point in the story's back half. Rather than remaining a passive victim throughout the film, Aino emerges as a natural leader among the captives, and Willamo plays that transformation with compelling conviction. When the moment finally arrives for the women to seize control of their own fate, commandeering a truck and turning captured weapons against their captors, Willamo's performance ensures that this shift feels like the natural culmination of a character who has been quietly assessing her situation and waiting for the right opportunity, rather than a sudden, unearned burst of heroism. It's a performance that adds crucial texture to the film's larger themes of resilience under unimaginable pressure. Jorma Tommila as Schutzer, a familiar face in a new register. Genre fans familiar with director Jalmari Helander's earlier work will recognize Jorma Tommila, who takes on the role of Schutzer, the convoy's tank driver. His casting adds an extra layer of continuity to Helander's body of work, given his prior collaborations with the director, and his presence in Sisu, now playing a considerably more antagonistic figure within Heldorf's ranks, demonstrates a compelling versatility. Schutzer meets a suitably grim end at the hands of his own commanding officer, a moment that underscores just how disposable every member of Heldorf's unit ultimately becomes to him once his obsession with the gold takes full hold. The soldiers of the SS platoon, a rogues gallery of doomed men. Rounding out Heldorf's platoon is an ensemble of performers tasked with the difficult job of making each fallen soldier feel like a distinct presence, even in a film that moves through its body count with relentless efficiency. Tatu Sinisalo appears as SS Soldier 1, one of the many faces the audience encounters as Artemis' path of retribution unfolds. Wilhelm Inkel takes on the role of SS Soldier 3, while Vincent Willestrand rounds out the platoon's ranks as SS Soldier 4. Each of these performers contributes to the sense that Heldorf's unit, however disciplined it may initially appear, is ultimately composed of individual men who each meet their own specific, often inventive demise at Artemis' hands. Severi Sorinen appears as the troop leader, a role that carries the weight of frontline command decisions during the platoon's increasingly chaotic pursuit. Meanwhile, Arttu Kapulainen takes on the tense role of the rower, one of the soldiers sent out onto the lake in the film's unforgettable underwater confrontation, a sequence that transforms a routine search mission into one of the film's most inventive and unsettling set pieces. The airmen, brief roles with outsized consequences. Sisu's midpoint hinges on a tense sequence involving a German aircraft searching for fuel, and the performers behind that plane's crew help sell the sudden, brutal turn the story takes in that moment. Ilkka Koivula appears as the fighter pilot, while Pekka Huotari takes on the role of pilot. Small roles, lasting impressions. Even beyond its central conflict, Sisu makes efficient use of smaller supporting roles to flesh out the world surrounding its central story. Armu Milonov appears as the bank teller, a brief but memorable presence that helps ground the film's post-war economic stakes, the value of gold, and what it means to different people scrambling to survive in the wreckage of a collapsing conflict. A cast united by purpose. What ultimately unites this entire ensemble, from Jorma Tommila's towering central performance down to the smallest supporting role, is a shared commitment to serving Sisu's singular, mythic vision. This isn't a film built around large, sprawling character arcs for its supporting cast. It's a tightly wound thriller where every performer understands precisely what function their character serves within the larger machine of the story. The soldiers exist to demonstrate the escalating danger and inventiveness of Artemis' campaign of survival. The captive women exist to illustrate the human cost of Heldorf's cruelty and, eventually, to reclaim agency in the story's climactic uprising. And at the center of it all, Tommila and Hennie deliver a study in contrasts, unbreakable resolve versus desperate self-interest, that gives the film its thematic backbone. It's this precision of purpose, shared collectively across the cast, that helps explain why Sisu resonates so powerfully despite its relatively lean, economical storytelling. Every face on screen, however briefly glimpsed, contributes to a larger portrait of a world stripped down to its most brutal essentials: survival, greed, and the almost mythic willpower required to endure when everything else has been taken away. Sisu at the box office: how a small Finnish film made massive history entering a crowded weekend as the underdog. Every box office story needs context, and Sisu's financial journey in North America begins with a snapshot of competition that immediately frames it as the scrappy underdog of its release weekend. When Sisu finally hit American and Canadian theaters, it wasn't stepping into an empty marketplace waiting to be conquered. Instead, it arrived alongside two very different, higher-profile releases: the biographical sports drama Big George Foreman, chronicling the legendary boxer's remarkable life story, and the emotionally resonant coming-of-age adaptation Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, based on the beloved literary classic. Both of these films carried the kind of built-in name recognition and pre-existing audience awareness that a subtitled, mid-budget Finnish action thriller simply didn't have going in. Given this competitive landscape, industry projections for Sisu's opening weekend were understandably modest. Analysts and box office trackers anticipated the film would gross somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 million, playing across a relatively limited footprint of roughly 900 theaters. For context, major studio tentpole releases routinely open in 3 to 4 times that many locations, so a 900-theater rollout signaled a deliberately measured, platform-style release rather than an attempt to dominate multiplexes nationwide from day one. This was a calculated bet by distributors, allowing the film's word-of-mouth and critical buzz from its Toronto premiere to build momentum in more targeted markets before potentially expanding further. A strong first day sets the tone. Despite modest expectations, Sisu's opening day performance offered an early hint that the film might be resonating with audiences more strongly than projections suggested. The film pulled in approximately $1.4 million on its very first day of release, a number bolstered significantly by an unusually robust Thursday night preview performance, which alone accounted for $585,000 of that total. Strong Thursday preview numbers are often treated by industry analysts as an early signal of genuine audience enthusiasm rather than manufactured hype, since preview crowds tend to be composed disproportionately of dedicated genre fans and early adopters actively seeking the film out rather than casual moviegoers stumbling into whatever's playing. This kind of preview strength suggested that Sisu had already begun cultivating a passionate, engaged fanbase in the months following its festival buzz, one eager to show up the moment tickets became available rather than waiting to see how the film performed before committing their time and money. Opening weekend: modest numbers, meaningful momentum. When the full opening weekend tallies came in, Sisu debuted with $3.3 million, landing at the 8th position on the weekend box office chart. On the surface, an 8th-place finish might not sound like a headline-grabbing achievement, especially in a marketplace dominated by franchise blockbusters and heavily marketed studio releases. But context is everything in box office analysis, and for a foreign-language adjacent, star power-light action thriller playing in fewer theaters than most of the films ranked above it, cracking the top 10 at all represented a genuinely solid result. It signaled that Sisu wasn't simply riding a wave of curiosity that would fade after a single weekend, but was instead building the kind of sustainable audience interest that could translate into meaningful long-term earnings as the film's theater count potentially expanded and positive word-of-mouth continued to spread. The long game: total domestic and international earnings. Where Sisu's box office story truly becomes compelling isn't in its opening weekend numbers alone, but in its overall theatrical run and staying power. By the time its theatrical run concluded, Sisu had accumulated a total of $7.3 million across the United States and Canada. When combined with its performance in international markets, where it added a further $7 million in ticket sales, the film's worldwide theatrical total climbed to an impressive $14.3 million. To put that figure into perspective, recall that Sisu was produced on a budget of roughly $6.5 million. A worldwide box office total of $14.3 million against that kind of production spend represents a genuinely strong return on investment, particularly once the additional costs of marketing and distribution are factored into the equation. In an industry landscape where countless mid-budget films struggle to recoup their costs even with far larger promotional pushes behind them, Sisu's ability to more than double its production budget through theatrical earnings alone speaks volumes about the strength of its critical reception and the effectiveness of its word-of-mouth-driven rollout strategy. The critics weigh in. Why Sisu became a certified crowd pleaser, a near-unanimous chorus of approval. When a film built around such an outlandish, almost cartoonishly violent premise manages to win over the critical establishment as thoroughly as Sisu did, it's worth pausing to understand exactly why. This wasn't a film that snuck past critics on the strength of low expectations or niche genre appeal alone. it was embraced with a level of enthusiasm that few action films, foreign or domestic, managed to achieve. Across the review landscape, from major aggregator platforms to individual critics writing for some of the most respected publications in the industry, a consistent pattern emerged. Reviewers weren't just tolerating Sisu's excesses, they were actively celebrating them. The numbers behind the acclaim. On Rotten Tomatoes, one of the most widely referenced review aggregation platforms in the industry, Sisu achieved a remarkably strong 94% positive rating drawn from a substantial pool of 181 critic reviews, with critics awarding the film an average score of 7.6 out of 10. These aren't the numbers of a film that merely satisfied genre expectations, they reflect broad, enthusiastic consensus across a wide swath of professional critics. The site's official critical consensus captured the film's dual nature succinctly, framing it as a stripped-down yet gleefully over-the-top homage that delivers exactly the kind of visceral, blood-soaked payoff that dedicated action fans crave. Metacritic, which employs a more mathematically weighted scoring system designed to account for the relative prestige and influence of different publications, assigned Sisu a score of 70 out of 100 based on 25 critic reviews, a result the platform categorizes as generally favorable. While this number sits slightly more conservatively than the enthusiastic Rotten Tomatoes tally, it still represents a comfortably positive critical reception, especially notable for a genre film that leans so heavily into stylized, exaggerated violence rather than prestige-driven subject matter. Perhaps most tellingly, audience reception mirrored critical enthusiasm rather than diverging from it, a pattern that doesn't always hold true for genre cinema. Polling conducted by PostTrack, which surveys actual moviegoers immediately after they've seen a film in theaters, found that 80% of respondents rated Sisu positively, with a striking 60% stating they would definitely recommend the film to others. That kind of alignment between critical and audience response suggests Sisu wasn't simply a film that played well to critics with a specific appreciation for genre subversion. It was connecting broadly with everyday audiences seeking pure entertainment value. Individual critics dig into what makes Sisu work. Beyond the aggregate scores, it's in the individual reviews from working critics that Sisu's specific appeal becomes clearest, with reviewers repeatedly circling back to the same core observation: this is a film that fully commits to its own outrageousness rather than second-guessing itself. Robert Daniels, writing for RogerEbert.com, awarded the film a strong 3.5 out of 4 stars, framing his praise around the film's fearless embrace of absurdity. Daniels highlighted that despite Sisu's underlying thematic ambitions, part of what makes the film so purely entertaining is its willingness to be nonsensical rather than staying tethered to those deeper themes. This observation gets at something essential about Sisu's success. Rather than weighing down its lean, propulsive action with excessive philosophical seriousness, the film trusts its audience to appreciate spectacle for spectacle's sake while still allowing thematic resonance to exist beneath the surface for those looking for it. Ross Boname of Collider arrived at a similarly appreciative verdict, awarding the film a solid B grade. Boname's review captured a sentiment that ran through much of the film's critical reception, acknowledging the inherent silliness of its premise while making clear that watching a substantial number of Nazi villains face brutal comeuppance carries its own straightforward satisfaction. This kind of candid acknowledgement, that Sisu's appeal lies partly in simple, unapologetic wish fulfillment, speaks to why the film resonated so broadly. It isn't attempting to reinvent the wheel narratively, it's delivering a deeply satisfying genre exercise with real craft and conviction behind it. Tom Schon of The Times offered one of the more analytically rich assessments of the film, awarding it 4 out of 5 stars and drawing an illuminating comparison to two very different filmmaking sensibilities. Schon characterized the film's violence as pulpy and maximalist in a manner reminiscent of Quentin Tarantino's work, describing scenes where bones shatter and blood erupts across the frame, while simultaneously praising the tightness and control of its storytelling, comparing that narrative discipline favorably to the classic Western filmmaking of Sergio Leone. This comparison is particularly astute because it captures the film's dual identity. Visually and viscerally, Sisu indulges in exaggerated, almost operatic violence, yet structurally, it never loses sight of its narrative economy, building tension and payoff with the same patient precision found in classic genre filmmaking. An international perspective came from critic Noyon Jyoti Parasara, whose review offered a culturally specific lens on the film's appeal. Parasara observed that despite its wildly improbable premise, the film never once tips over into feeling genuinely silly, and he framed that achievement using a Hindi phrase describing excellent value for money, translating the sentiment for readers unfamiliar with the term as getting real bang for your buck. A video game legend adds his voice. Perhaps the most unexpected and widely circulated piece of praise Sisu received didn't come from a traditional film critic at all, but from one of the most celebrated figures in the video game industry. On August 1, 2023, Hideo Kojima, the acclaimed Japanese game designer best known worldwide for creating the influential Metal Gear franchise, took to Twitter to share his enthusiastic reaction to the film. Kojima's endorsement carried particular weight given his own reputation for crafting elaborate, genre-blending action narratives across his game design career, lending his praise a level of credibility among genre enthusiasts that a conventional film critic simply couldn't replicate. Kojima's message framed Sisu as transcending typical war movie conventions entirely, describing it instead as an intense, almost frenzied battle between remarkably formidable men. He went on to praise the film's combat choreography and creative fight sequences as surpassing even the legendary action beats associated with the Rambo franchise, directly invoking the film's central figure with the evocative descriptor, the Immortal Old Man, a clear nod to Artemy's in-universe nickname among Soviet forces. Perhaps most notably, Kojima's message didn't stop at simple praise. He explicitly expressed genuine interest in potentially developing a video game centered around the film's protagonist, a remarkable crossover endorsement that speaks to just how deeply Artemy Corpy's mythic, larger-than-life persona resonated even among creators working in entirely different entertainment mediums. This kind of high-profile, cross-industry recognition is exceedingly rare for a mid-budget foreign genre film, and it significantly amplified Sisu's visibility among gaming and pop culture audiences who might not otherwise have encountered a Finnish World War II action thriller through traditional film marketing channels. Kojima's massive following and considerable cultural influence within gaming and entertainment circles meant his endorsement functioned as a powerful, organic word-of-mouth amplifier, introducing the film to an entirely new segment of potential viewers. What ties these reviews together? Looking across this collection of critical responses, several consistent threads emerge that help explain exactly why Sisu achieved such broad and enthusiastic acclaim. First and foremost, critics repeatedly praised the film's confidence in its own identity. Rather than hedging its bets by tempering its violence or apologizing for its more outlandish narrative turns, Sisu commits fully to its mythic, almost folkloric premise, and critics consistently rewarded that fearlessness rather than penalizing it. Second, there's a recurring appreciation for the film's structural discipline, even amid its chaotic, blood-soaked set pieces. Multiple reviewers, from Sean's comparison to classic Western filmmaking to the Rotten Tomatoes consensus itself, specifically highlighted the tightness and leanness of the film's narrative construction. This is a crucial point of distinction for action cinema broadly. Plenty of films deliver spectacular violence, but far fewer manage to pair that spectacle with genuinely disciplined storytelling that never loses momentum or clarity, even as the body count climbs into increasingly absurd territory. Third, critics repeatedly situated Sisu within a broader lineage of influential genre touchstones, invoking comparisons to Tarantino, to John Wick, to Inglourious Basterds, to Rambo, while simultaneously acknowledging that the film manages to feel distinct and fresh rather than derivative. This balancing act, drawing clear inspiration from beloved genre predecessors while still carving out its own unique identity rooted in specifically Finnish history and cultural concepts, appears to be central to why so many critics responded so favorably. Finally, there's the simple, undeniable factor of pure audience satisfaction, echoed across nearly every review discussed here, from Boname's candid acknowledgement of the visceral pleasure in watching villains face consequences, to Parasara's framing of the film as delivering genuine value and payoff for viewers' time and attention. Critics weren't just intellectually appreciating Sisu's craft from a distance, they were having fun watching it, and that infectious enthusiasm clearly translated into their writing. A rare alignment of critics, audiences, and unexpected voices. What makes Sisu's critical reception particularly noteworthy within the broader context of contemporary genre filmmaking is the remarkable alignment across multiple, often disconnected audiences. Professional critics writing for prestigious outlets, everyday moviegoers polled immediately after screenings, and even celebrated creative figures from entirely separate entertainment industries all converged on strikingly similar conclusions about the film's quality and appeal. This kind of broad consensus is genuinely rare, particularly for a film built around such an extreme, deliberately excessive premise. Ultimately, the critical response to Sisu reflects a broader truth about what audiences and critics alike are often hungry for in contemporary action cinema, not necessarily innovation for its own sake, but confident, well-executed genre filmmaking that knows precisely what it wants to be and pursues that vision without apology or compromise. Jalmari Hilander and his collaborators clearly understood the specific pleasures that draw audiences to this kind of unapologetic, high body count action storytelling, and the near-unanimous critical enthusiasm that greeted Sisu stands as a testament to just how effectively that vision was ultimately realized on screen. Reading between the reviews, what critics really saw in Sisu, why critical reception matters so much for a film like this. When a film built around such a delirious, over-the-top premise, a lone gold prospector single-handedly dismantling an entire Nazi platoon through increasingly inventive brutality, earns near-universal critical praise, it's worth digging deeper than the surface-level scores to understand exactly what critics were responding to. Sisu wasn't a film that critics merely tolerated as guilty-pleasure entertainment, nor was it dismissed as empty spectacle unworthy of serious consideration. Instead, across dozens of reviews from wildly different publications, cultural contexts, and critical sensibilities, a genuinely thoughtful conversation emerged about why this particular action film worked so effectively, and what it revealed about the state of genre filmmaking more broadly. Understanding that conversation means looking past the star ratings and percentage scores to the actual reasoning critics offered. The central paradox critics kept circling back to. If there's one thread that runs through nearly every substantial review of Sisu, it's an attempt to reconcile a genuine paradox. How does a film this absurd, this over-the-top, this willing to abandon physical plausibility entirely, manage to feel so controlled and confident rather than sloppy or self-indulgent? This tension between narrative discipline and gleeful excess became the defining question critics kept returning to, and their answers reveal a lot about what separates genuinely well-crafted genre filmmaking from mere spectacle. Robert Daniels of RogerEbert.com articulated this paradox perhaps most directly, awarding the film 3.5 out of 4 stars while specifically praising its refusal to take its own deeper themes too seriously. His framing suggested something important, that Sisu's entertainment value stems precisely from its willingness to let go of self-importance, embracing nonsensical, escalating violence without constantly justifying itself through weighty thematic gestures. This is a notable observation because it runs somewhat counter to a common critical instinct that rewards films for depth and message above all else. Daniels instead celebrated Sisu for understanding when restraint isn't the goal, when full-throated commitment to absurdity is actually the more courageous and effective choice. This sentiment echoed throughout other reviews as well. Ross Boname's assessment for Collider, landing at a respectable B grade, leaned into a similarly candid acknowledgement that part of what makes Sisu so enjoyable is the straightforward, almost primal satisfaction of watching morally repugnant villains suffer creative, well-deserved consequences. Boname wasn't dressing up his praise in elaborate critical theory, he was being honest about the visceral, uncomplicated pleasure the film delivers, and treating that honesty as a legitimate critical observation rather than something to be embarrassed about. The Tarantino and Leone comparison, structure meets spectacle. Among the more analytically substantive reviews, Tom Schon's piece for The Times stands out for offering perhaps the most precise articulation of what makes Sisu's specific brand of violence work as well as it does. Schon drew a dual comparison that's worth unpacking carefully. He likened the film's visual approach to violence, bone snapping, bodies breaking apart, blood arcing dramatically across the frame, to the pulpy, maximalist aesthetic long associated with Quentin Tarantino's filmography. At the same time, he praised the underlying storytelling structure as being as tightly constructed as a classic Sergio Leone western. This comparison matters because it identifies two entirely separate axes on which a film can succeed or fail, and argues that Sisu excels on both simultaneously. Tarantino's influence speaks to tone and visual language, an embrace of stylized, almost operatic violence that revels in its own theatricality rather than pursuing gritty realism. Leone's influence, by contrast, speaks to narrative architecture, the patient, deliberate build of tension, the economical use of silence and space, the sense that every scene is earning its place within a carefully constructed whole. Many action films manage one of these qualities without the other. Some deliver spectacular, over-the-top violence within a narratively bloated or incoherent structure, while others maintain tight pacing but deliver relatively restrained, unmemorable action sequences. Schon's review essentially argues that Sisu's critical success stems from refusing to compromise on either front. A global conversation, not just a Western one. One of the more striking aspects of Sisu's critical reception is how consistently international critics engaged with the film on its own terms, often bringing culturally specific frameworks to bear on their analysis rather than simply filtering it through familiar Hollywood or European arthouse comparisons. Noyon Duty Parasara's review offers a particularly vivid example of this. Rather than reaching for Western genre touchstones, Parasara evaluated the film through a distinctly different cultural lens, observing that despite its wildly improbable premise, Sisu never once tips into feeling genuinely silly or self-parodic. His use of a Hindi-language phrase to capture the film's value proposition, essentially describing it as delivering excellent bang for your buck, reveals something important about Sisu's cross-cultural appeal. This wasn't a film that succeeded only among critics steeped in specific Western genre traditions who could appreciate its references to Tarantino or classic Westerns. It resonated with critics evaluating it through entirely different cultural frameworks, judging it on more universal terms. Does this deliver satisfying entertainment value? Does it earn its more outrageous moments through sustained craft and commitment? Parasara's affirmative answer, delivered through a culturally specific idiom, underscores just how broadly the film's core appeal translated across different critical traditions and audience expectations. Situating Sisu within a genre lineage. Jason Bailey's review for the New York Times took a somewhat different analytical approach, focusing less on the film's internal mechanics and more on its strategic positioning within the contemporary action landscape. Bailey praised director Jalmari Hilandar's evident commercial savvy in constructing what he characterized as an efficient synthesis of the most crowd-pleasing elements from two hugely influential but tonally distinct action properties, the sleek, hyper-stylized gunplay and world-building of the John Wick franchise, and the audaciously irreverent, historically subversive Nazi-hunting violence of Inglourious Basterds. This framing is worth sitting with because it positions Sisu not as an entirely novel cinematic invention, but as a shrewdly assembled hybrid that identifies precisely which elements of proven, beloved action properties resonate most strongly with contemporary audiences, then recombines them into something that feels fresh despite drawing on familiar source material. Bailey's praise implicitly credits Hilandar not just with directorial craft but with a kind of curatorial intelligence, understanding the current action film marketplace well enough to identify a genuinely underexplored niche and execute within it with real precision. This lineage-based critical approach also helps explain part of why Sisu achieved such broad acclaim rather than appealing only to a narrow slice of action purists. By evoking both the balletic, almost mythic combat choreography associated with John Wick and the gleeful historical irreverence of Inglourious Basterds, critics were essentially signaling to two overlapping but distinct fan communities that this film had something specifically calibrated for them. The Rotten Tomatoes consensus as a critical thesis statement. It's worth pausing on the specific language used in Rotten Tomatoes' official critical consensus for Sisu, since aggregator consensus statements often distill dozens of individual reviews into a single representative thesis. The consensus specifically described the film as narratively lean while simultaneously being deliriously gory, characterizing it as an inspired pastiche that delivers genuine bloody satisfaction specifically to action aficionados. Every word in that consensus statement carries analytical weight. Narratively lean directly echoes the structural praise found throughout individual reviews, the sense that Sisu never wastes time on unnecessary subplots or bloated exposition. Deliriously gory acknowledges the film's willingness to fully commit to graphic, exaggerated violence without apology. Inspired pastiche is perhaps the most critically loaded phrase here, explicitly categorizing the film as drawing consciously and skillfully from established genre traditions rather than claiming false originality, while still crediting that borrowing as creative and well executed rather than derivative or lazy. And the specific targeting of action aficionados as the intended beneficiary of that bloody satisfaction acknowledges that while the film achieved broad crossover appeal, its most devoted admirers would likely be genre enthusiasts already primed to appreciate its specific pleasures. Kojima's unconventional but telling endorsement. While not a traditional film critic, Hideo Kojima's widely circulated public praise for Sisu deserves serious consideration as a piece of critical response in its own right, precisely because of what his unique perspective reveals. As a celebrated creator whose own work in the Metal Gear franchise has long blended cinematic storytelling ambitions with meticulously choreographed action design, Kojima brought a distinctly craft-focused lens to his assessment of the film. His characterization of Sisu as transcending typical war movie conventions, describing it instead as an intense, almost frenzied clash between exceptionally formidable men, speaks to how thoroughly the film succeeded in reframing its historical wartime setting as something closer to mythic combat storytelling than conventional war cinema. Kojima's specific praise for the film's fight choreography, which he suggested surpassed even the celebrated action sequences of the Rambo franchise, carries particular weight given his own decades of experience designing and evaluating combat systems and sequences across an entirely different creative medium. Most tellingly, Kojima's expressed interest in developing a video game centered on the film's protagonist reveals something significant about how thoroughly Sisu succeeded in creating a genuinely iconic, mythic central character. Video game adaptations of this kind typically emerge from properties whose central figures possess a very specific quality, an almost archetypal simplicity and power fantasy appeal that translates naturally into interactive combat systems. Kojima's instinct that Artemi Corpi possesses exactly this quality, expressed spontaneously through a public social media post rather than a formal review, offers a uniquely candid piece of evidence about just how effectively the film achieved its myth-making ambitions. Why critics and audiences rarely align this closely. One of the more analytically interesting aspects of Sisu's reception is the unusually tight correlation between critical scores and audience response. The post-track polling data showing 80% positive audience reception, with 60% explicitly stating they'd recommend the film, tracks remarkably closely with the enthusiasm found in professional critical reviews. This kind of alignment is genuinely uncommon in contemporary film criticism, where a persistent gap often exists between critical darlings that underwhelm general audiences and crowd-pleasing hits that critics regard as intellectually thin or artistically unambitious. Sisu's ability to bridge that gap speaks to something critics repeatedly identified in their reviews. The film succeeds simultaneously on the level of pure visceral entertainment and on the level of genuine formal craft. Audiences responded to the raw satisfaction of watching an unstoppable protagonist dismantle irredeemable villains through increasingly creative means. Critics, meanwhile, responded to the disciplined narrative construction, the confident directorial vision, and the skillful genre synthesis underlying that surface-level satisfaction. When a film manages to deliver both of these experiences simultaneously, without one undermining the other, it tends to produce exactly the kind of broad, cross-audience consensus that Sisu achieved. The broader critical takeaway. Taken as a whole, the critical conversation surrounding Sisu reveals a broader appetite within contemporary film criticism for genre work that commits fully to its own identity rather than hedging toward prestige-adjacent respectability. Critics across wildly different publications, writing from different cultural contexts and critical traditions, consistently rewarded the same underlying qualities: narrative economy, visual and tonal confidence, skillful synthesis of established genre influences, and an unapologetic embrace of spectacle in service of genuine audience satisfaction. This critical consensus also offers a kind of implicit rebuke to the notion that genre filmmaking must apologize for its own pleasures or dress itself up in unnecessary thematic weight to earn critical respectability. Sisu earned its acclaim not by transcending its genre trappings, but by executing them with such precision and confidence that critics felt compelled to take that execution seriously as a genuine cinematic achievement. Ultimately, what critics saw in Sisu was a film that understood exactly what kind of experience it wanted to deliver, and pursued that vision with total conviction from its opening frames through its explosive conclusion. That clarity of purpose, more than any single technical or narrative element, appears to be the through line connecting every positive review, every enthusiastic audience poll response, and even the unexpected public praise from a celebrated video game designer thousands of miles removed from traditional film criticism. In an industry often characterized by compromise, hedging, and audience-testing-driven creative dilution, Sisu's critical reception stands as a compelling reminder that full, fearless commitment to a singular creative vision remains one of the most reliable paths to genuine audience and critical acclaim alike. Sisu, 2022, Box Office Explained. How a €6 million Finnish action movie became a worldwide success? Sisu, 2022, is one of those rare action movies whose box office story is almost as interesting as the film itself. Directed and written by Jalmari Hilander and starring Jorma Tommila as the nearly unstoppable Artemi Corpi, the Finnish action thriller was produced on a relatively modest budget of about €6 million, or approximately $6.5 million. Despite its limited scale compared with major Hollywood action productions, the film eventually earned roughly $14.24 million worldwide according to Box Office Mojo. That number may not sound enormous when compared with Hollywood blockbusters that regularly make hundreds of millions of dollars. But looking at Sisu purely through its worldwide gross would miss the real story. This was a Finnish production with a relatively small budget, a short 91-minute runtime, an R rating in the United States, limited initial theatrical exposure, and a premise that was far outside the mainstream Hollywood formula. Yet it managed to turn strong festival buzz and word of mouth into a surprisingly successful international theatrical run. The movie's financial journey demonstrates an important lesson about modern cinema. A film does not necessarily need a gigantic box office to become a commercial success. For a low-budget production, controlling costs, finding the right audience, selling the concept effectively, and expanding internationally can be far more important than competing directly with $100 million blockbusters. Below is a detailed examination of Sisu's box office performance, including its budget, domestic opening, international performance, profitability, distribution strategy, audience appeal, and why the film became such an important success for Finnish cinema. 1. What was the budget of Sisu? The first number we need to understand is the production budget. Sisu was made for approximately €6 million, commonly reported as around $6.5 million. For Hollywood, $6.5 million is extremely small for an action movie. Consider what an action film normally requires. There may be vehicles, weapons, explosions, stunt performers, visual effects, period costumes, locations, elaborate sets, safety personnel, post-production work, cinematography equipment, transportation, insurance and extensive marketing. Sisu had many of these challenges because it is set during World War II and contains numerous action sequences involving German soldiers, vehicles, explosions and brutal combat. Director Jalmari Helander understood that the production could not compete financially with enormous Hollywood action films. Instead, he approached the movie creatively. Helander explained that because he did not have a $100 million budget, he needed to make the action inventive and unpredictable rather than simply throwing money at spectacle. This decision became one of the film's biggest financial strengths. Instead of asking, "How can we make this look like a $100 million movie?" the production effectively asked, "How can we make a $6 million movie feel bigger than it actually is?" That distinction is extremely important. The movie uses the harsh landscapes of Finnish Lapland as a major visual asset. Vast natural locations can provide scale without requiring expensive digital environments. The isolated setting also works perfectly with the story because Artemi Korpi is essentially trapped in a wilderness where there are no authorities coming to rescue him. The landscape becomes part of the production design. This allowed the filmmakers to create an action movie that sometimes looks much more expensive than its actual budget. 2. Why the $14.2 million worldwide gross matters. According to Box Office Mojo, Sisu ultimately generated approximately domestic, $7,265, $622 international, $6,970 for 79 worldwide, $14,236,101. The domestic market therefore represented about 51% of the worldwide total, while international markets contributed about 49%. That is a remarkably balanced split. The film was not dependent entirely on the United States, nor was it simply a local Finnish success. It became an international theatrical product. The worldwide gross was roughly 2.2 times its reported $6.5 million production budget. However, this does not mean the producers simply received $14.2 million in profit. This is one of the most important things to explain when discussing box office. A movie's worldwide gross is the amount collected by cinemas and distributors from ticket sales. The production company does not receive every dollar. Theaters retain a portion of ticket revenue, while distributors and other participants also take their shares. Marketing and distribution costs must also be considered. Therefore, saying $14.2 million box office minus $6.5 million budget equals $7.7 million profit would be an oversimplification. Nevertheless, for a movie produced for roughly $6 million, reaching more than $14 million worldwide represents a very strong theatrical result. And the film had additional revenue opportunities beyond cinemas, including home entertainment and other distribution arrangements. 3. The Finnish box office was especially important. Before Sisu became an international phenomenon, it was first a Finnish movie. That matters because the film was not created as a conventional American blockbuster. It was deeply connected to Finnish history, Finnish landscapes and Finnish cultural identity. The movie premiered theatrically in Finland on January 27, 2023. It had already generated attention through its festival exposure, including its premiere in the Midnight Madness section of the Toronto International Film Festival in September 2022. Its Finnish performance became an important foundation for the film's international reputation. Industry reporting later described Sisu as having crossed $11.7 million worldwide by June 2023, with more than $7 million coming from the United States at that stage. The Finnish Film Foundation described it as a major achievement for Finnish cinema. Another industry report noted that the film earned more than €2.4 million in its domestic Finnish market and ultimately reached more than 150,000 admissions in Finland. For a Finnish-language action movie, those numbers are particularly meaningful. The film was not merely a niche foreign-language experiment. It became a recognizable Finnish cinematic export. 4. The Toronto International Film Festival was a major turning point. One of the most important elements in Sisu's box office story happened before its major theatrical release. The film premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival in the Midnight Madness section in September 2022. Festival exposure can be extremely valuable for an independent film. Why? Because a small movie normally cannot compete with a major studio production in advertising expenditure. A Hollywood blockbuster may have months of enormous advertising campaigns, television commercials, social media promotion, billboards, and international premieres. A smaller Finnish action film does not have those resources. Festival audiences can therefore become an alternative marketing machine. If viewers love a film, they talk about it. Critics write about it. Social media users share clips and reactions. Movie websites publish articles. Suddenly, the film has something that money cannot easily purchase. Curiosity. That was particularly useful for Sisu because its concept was easy to communicate. The basic pitch was extraordinarily simple. A legendary Finnish soldier finds gold during the final days of World War II, but Nazi soldiers attempt to steal it from him, and discover that they have picked the wrong man to attack. That is an extremely marketable idea. 5. The United States became the film's biggest international opportunity. The American release was arguably the most important part of Sisu's commercial story. Lionsgate handled the North American theatrical distribution. Box Office Mojo lists Lionsgate as the domestic distributor. The film received an American theatrical release on April 28, 2023. Its opening weekend was $3,330,891. That came from approximately 1,006 theaters. This is an impressive opening for a small Finnish action film. The movie opened with a relatively modest per-theater average of approximately $3,311. But the more important point was that it entered the American market with enough awareness to generate a meaningful audience. The opening weekend placed Sisu among the notable releases of that particular weekend. It did not need to defeat the biggest Hollywood movies to succeed. Its real competition was its own production cost. 6. Breaking down the American opening weekend. Let's look more closely at the opening. On Friday, Sisu earned approximately $1.38 million. On Saturday, it generated about $1.12 million. And on Sunday, $828,666. The three-day domestic opening therefore reached approximately $3.33 million. This pattern is typical of a movie driven heavily by opening night curiosity. People who had already heard about the film were eager to see it. The film's marketing had effectively communicated the central attraction. A nearly unstoppable Finnish warrior fighting Nazis in an exaggerated, ultra-violent action-adventure. That was enough to attract its target audience. The movie's unique selling point helped its box office. One of the biggest reasons Sisu performed beyond expectations was that it did not feel like a generic action movie. The modern action marketplace is crowded. Audiences have seen superheroes, assassins, military commandos, spies, criminals, secret agents, futuristic soldiers, monster hunters. Sisu introduced something different. Its hero was essentially a Finnish mythological action figure. Artemi Korpi does not spend the movie delivering long speeches. He does not explain his emotions. He does not behave like a conventional Hollywood protagonist. In fact, the character barely speaks for most of the movie. That unusual presentation became part of the film's identity. It also made the movie easy to market visually. A rugged man. A destroyed World War II landscape. A bag of gold. Nazi soldiers. Tanks. Explosions. And an almost impossible-to-kill protagonist. The concept was immediately understandable. 8. Why the low budget actually helped Sisu. It may sound strange, but the movie's low budget was part of its commercial advantage. Suppose Sisu had cost $60 million. A $14.2 million worldwide gross would have been a catastrophic result. But because it reportedly cost around $6.5 million, the same $14.2 million gross tells a completely different story. This is the fundamental principle of box office economics. Revenue must always be evaluated against investment. A $200 million film earning $300 million worldwide may still struggle to become profitable after marketing, theater splits and distribution costs. Meanwhile, a $6 million film earning $14 million can potentially be in a much healthier financial position. That is why Sisu should not be judged using the same standard as a Marvel movie or a major Disney blockbuster. Its financial target was fundamentally different. 9. The domestic to international balance. One of the most fascinating aspects of the final box office is how balanced the revenue became. Box Office Mojo lists approximately 51% domestic and 49% international. That means the movie successfully traveled beyond Finland. For an internationally distributed Finnish film, this is significant. The United States alone generated more than $7.2 million domestically. That means the American market eventually contributed roughly half of the movie's worldwide theatrical gross. This transformed Sisu from a local Finnish production into an international action brand. 10. India and other international markets. The movie also received releases in other territories. For example, Box Office Mojo reports that Sisu earned approximately $284,359 in India. It opened in India on 369 theaters and collected around $130,475 during its first weekend. This illustrates another important characteristic of the movie. It was not dependent upon dialogue-heavy storytelling. Action is one of the most internationally accessible forms of cinema. A viewer does not need extensive knowledge of Finnish history to understand. A man has gold. Bad guys want the gold. The man refuses to give it to them. Violence follows. That simplicity helped the movie travel. 11. The film's runtime was also a commercial advantage. Sisu runs for approximately 91 minutes. That is short compared with many contemporary action movies. This may have helped its theatrical economics in several ways. First, audiences could watch the movie without making a major time commitment. Second, its pacing is aggressive. The movie does not spend a huge amount of time establishing complicated subplots. Third, the short runtime fits the film's fundamental concept. Sisu is essentially an action experience. It does not need 3 hours to explain its world. For an audience looking for an intense evening of action, 91 minutes can actually be an attractive proposition. 12. Why the R rating was not a commercial disaster. In the United States, Sisu received an R rating. Box Office Mojo lists the film as R-rated. That automatically limits the potential audience compared with a PG-13 movie. But the R rating was also part of the product. The violence is one of Sisu's defining characteristics. The movie deliberately embraces exaggerated brutality. Instead of hiding its violence, the filmmakers use it as entertainment. That meant the R rating probably made the film less accessible to families but more attractive to the exact audience being targeted: adult action and thriller fans. In other words, the film did not attempt to be everything for everyone. It targeted a specific audience and delivered exactly what that audience wanted. 13. Word of mouth was crucial. Another major factor was word of mouth. A movie like Sisu can benefit enormously from audience recommendations because the concept is unusual enough to generate conversation. Someone watches the movie and tells a friend, "You have to see this Finnish action movie." That is valuable marketing. The film's unusual combination of World War II setting, Western influences, exaggerated action, and near-superhuman protagonist gave viewers plenty to discuss. The producer Petri Jokiranta later explained that the success in the United States had been planned through targeting the right audience and working with distribution partners early. That is important. The movie's success was not simply an accident. There was a strategy behind identifying its audience. 14. The film was designed for a specific audience. One of Sisu's greatest strengths was its clarity of purpose. It was not trying to become a historical war drama. It was not trying to be a realistic military film. It was not trying to become a character-heavy Oscar drama. It was an exaggerated action movie inspired by older cinema. Hilander has discussed influences including First Blood, while the movie's style also evokes older action and adventure traditions. This made the movie particularly attractive to viewers who enjoy Rambo-style survival action, John Wick-style combat, revenge stories, exploitation cinema, westerns, World War II action, dark humor, extreme violence, minimalist protagonists. That audience may be smaller than the superhero audience. But it is passionate. And passionate audiences can be extremely valuable to independent films. 15. The John Wick effect. It is impossible to discuss Sisu's commercial positioning without mentioning the modern popularity of highly stylized action films. Movies such as John Wick helped demonstrate that audiences could embrace action films built around distinctive combat choreography, minimalist storytelling, and larger-than-life protagonists. Sisu does not simply copy John Wick, but it benefits from the same broader audience appetite. Viewers had become increasingly receptive to action movies where the hero is almost mythological. Artemi Korpi fits perfectly into that tradition. He is not presented as an ordinary man who suddenly becomes a superhero. He feels like a legend who has walked out of history. That made the film's action sequences its primary marketing tool. 16. Why Sisu looked more expensive than it was. One of the most impressive accomplishments of the movie is its visual presentation. A production budget of approximately $6.5 million would normally suggest serious limitations. Yet the film has large outdoor landscapes, military vehicles, explosions, combat sequences, period costumes, aerial imagery, destroyed environments, extensive action choreography. The Finnish landscape did much of the heavy lifting. Instead of building enormous sets, the filmmakers used the real wilderness. That is an excellent example of production economics. A filmmaker cannot manufacture a $100 million spectacle for $6 million. But a filmmaker can choose locations that naturally look spectacular. Hollander has spoken about the necessity of creativity when working with an action budget of this size. That philosophy directly affected the film's value proposition. The audience felt that it was getting more spectacle than the budget suggested. 17. Was Sisu a box office hit? The answer is yes, with an important qualification. If we define hit as a movie that generates a gigantic worldwide gross, then Sisu obviously was not a blockbuster. It earned approximately $14.24 million worldwide. But if we define success relative to budget, market position and expectations, the picture is much more positive. The film cost around €6 million. It earned over $14 million worldwide. It secured meaningful theatrical distribution in North America. It became a major international Finnish film. And its performance helped demonstrate that a Finnish action movie could successfully reach audiences outside Finland. Industry reporting explicitly described the film's American performance as a major achievement and identified it as the biggest Finnish film of the 21st century at that point. So Sisu was not a blockbuster. It was something arguably more interesting. A low-budget international breakout. Point 18. Understanding the difference between box office and profit. This point is essential for any YouTube explanation of movie finances. Suppose a movie earns $14.2 million worldwide. That does not mean the studio receives $14.2 million. Cinemas keep a portion. Distributors receive a portion. Different countries have different theatrical revenue arrangements. Marketing costs are separate. Production costs are separate. Therefore, the actual profitability of Sisu cannot be calculated simply from its public box office gross and reported production budget. However, the ratio between budget and gross is encouraging. The film's theatrical gross was more than double its reported production budget. That is a very different financial situation from an expensive blockbuster that earns only slightly more than its production cost. 19. Why the American opening was so important. The $3.33 million domestic opening represented a major milestone. For an international independent action movie, getting more than $3 million from the first weekend in approximately 1,000 theaters demonstrated that there was a real American audience for the film. The movie did not depend entirely on Finland or other Nordic territories. It had successfully crossed into the world's most important theatrical market. That gave the movie additional cultural credibility. When an independent foreign movie performs well in America, international distributors and audiences may become more interested. The American success becomes part of the marketing story itself. And that is exactly what happened with Sisu. 20. Sisu became bigger than its box office. Perhaps the most important lesson from the film is that its cultural impact exceeded its raw financial numbers. A $14 million movie may disappear quickly in a marketplace filled with $100 million blockbusters. But Sisu became recognizable because its concept was so distinctive. The title itself became memorable. The character of Artemi Korpi became memorable. The extreme action became memorable. And the Finnish identity of the movie became part of its appeal. The production proved that a film did not have to imitate Hollywood completely to succeed internationally. Instead, it could use its own cultural identity as part of its selling point. 21. The success helped create a sequel. The financial and audience response eventually helped make the idea of a sequel realistic. Hollander had indicated that the American box office performance would be an important factor in considering a continuation of Artemi Korpi's story. Later, he confirmed that he would return to direct the sequel. This demonstrates another way to measure box office success. The original movie did not merely generate ticket revenue. It created enough audience interest to support the expansion of the property. That is often the ultimate goal of successful independent cinema. A film can transform from a one-off project into a franchise. 22. The bigger lesson for independent filmmakers. The box office story of Sisu contains several lessons. First, control the budget. A smaller production gives a movie a lower financial barrier to success. Second, know the audience. Sisu knew exactly who wanted to see it. Third, create a memorable concept. Finnish gold prospector fights Nazis is instantly understandable. Fourth, use locations intelligently. Finnish Lapland provided enormous visual scale without requiring enormous sets. Fifth, festival exposure matters. Toronto helped introduce the movie to international audiences and critics. Sixth, international distribution is essential. The film could not have achieved its final result through Finland alone. Seventh, give audiences something they cannot easily get elsewhere. Sisu was not another generic Hollywood action film. It had a distinct Finnish identity. 23. Final box office numbers. Here is the simplest summary of Sisu's theatrical performance. Category approximate result production budget euro 6 million $6.5 million worldwide box office $14.24 million domestic box office $7.27 million international box office $6.97 million US. Opening weekend $3.33 million US. Widest release 1,006 theaters runtime 91 minutes US. Rating R. The figures above are based primarily on Box Office Mojo and industry reporting. Conclusion: was Sisu a financial success? Ultimately, Sisu is a fascinating example of how a small movie can compete successfully in the international marketplace without having a blockbuster budget. Its approximately €6 million production budget was tiny compared with the budgets of major Hollywood action movies. Yet the movie managed to earn approximately $14.24 million worldwide, with almost equal contributions from domestic and international markets. The American market was particularly important. The movie opened with approximately $3.33 million in the United States from around 1,006 theaters, proving that an unusual Finnish action movie could attract a substantial American audience. But the real success of Sisu cannot be measured by dollars alone. The film turned its limitations into advantages. It did not have the budget to create endless digital spectacle, so it used Finland's natural landscapes. It did not have dozens of major stars, so it built its marketing around a mysterious and almost mythological protagonist. It did not have a complicated story, so it delivered a direct, easily understandable action premise. It did not attempt to appeal to every demographic, so it focused heavily on adult action fans. And it did not try to hide its Finnish identity. Instead, it made that identity part of the movie's appeal. The result was a film that punched far above its financial weight. With a worldwide theatrical gross of roughly $14.2 million against a production budget of about $6.5 million, Sisu demonstrated why box office performance must always be judged in context. It was never designed to compete with Avatar, Marvel, or other billion-dollar franchises. Its victory was different. Sisu proved that a tightly focused, creatively made, low-budget action movie from Finland could cross borders, find an American audience, succeed internationally, and create enough demand for a sequel. And perhaps that is the most impressive part of its box office story. The movie did not become successful because it had unlimited money.